So you might be wondering why I'm continuing this playthrough, even though I said that I was going to discontinue all my other ones. Out of all the playthroughs that I promised I would do, I feel most morally obligated to do this one. Because Ghast has been waiting a really long time, he's worked very hard on this hack, and, you know, Ghast has also been a really swell guy to me. So I think I feel like I owe him at least a fucking playthrough of his game, you know? So I apologize, Ghast, for, you know, giving up too quickly. Let's get this show on the road. Boop! Mind games. So, I'm not sure why this chapter is called Mind Games, because I've played it, and I didn't see any mind games going on. Anyway, so you might notice that this video is 27 minutes. I actually did the math. I'd say about 17 minutes of this video is cutscenes, and the gameplay footage was sped up. Originally, this video was 35 minutes. That's how many cutscenes are in this fucking chapter. And that leads me to one of my main criticisms that I'm going to bring up, which is that there's too many cutscenes. Jeez. I know you're trying to establish all these characters and all this plot devices and stuff, but I hate to say this, but I haven't really been given much reason to care about Bram. Like, Bram is just a dude. I mean, obviously he cares about his little village, and he's trying to get the mayor to do that stuff, and that's a sympathetic goal, I understand that. But at the same time, he's not a particularly interesting character. He's enigmatic, which, you know, being an enigma is pretty cool and shit. I mean, just ask any fucking edgy swordmaster dude. It's always entertaining to watch those fucks get all just broody and shit, but I mean, that said, Bram doesn't seem like a particularly broody dude. He seems like a pretty nice guy, but at the same time, he's just not particularly interesting either. It's not like, for example, when I was playing Midnight Sun, I was immediately emotionally invested in Faratris, which I think informs people of my preference of character-driven stories. And to me, this seems like a game that's very plot-driven. But anyway, I'm going off on a random tangent. Let's actually talk about these fucking cutscenes, shall we? So, here, Bram's getting a message from the kids at the village, being all like, yeah, so, you know, the dog wants to be with you for some reason. We don't know why. I can only assume that, given the fact that this dog can kill a man with a single bite, that there's something else going on with this dog. Like, this dog might be special. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Wow, this dog seems like he's probably gonna be some fucking Mary Sue that the writer put in because he likes dogs and he wanted a super cool dog because, wow, a supercharged puppy that can be adorable at the same time? I'm gonna tell you to reserve judgment for now, as I am, because I totally get why you feel that way, but Ghast has told me, just wait a bit. You know, the dog isn't that poorly written. Actually, I think... Okay, but yeah, just reserve judgment for now. Just because the initial impression is bad does not mean that it's, you know, actually bad. Anyway, so Bram's doing the thing where he's getting haunted by some voice in his head or whatever, and, you know, Bram ain't taking that shit. Bram sees somebody fucking with him, and his first judgment is to be like, dude, fuck this guy. I'm not doing anything he wants. But of course, the voice in his head is gonna be a little more dangerous than that, because by Bram not cooperating, this guy's gonna be like, well, fuck you, you're gonna drown. Yeah, see, right here. And he's kind of fucking with him like, you know, you may think that you were dreaming just a moment ago with, you know, the fucking rainbow hair chick and the Celica wannabe, but it all felt rather real, didn't it? So, you know, there you go. And here's another theme I've noticed, is that every time Bram goes through one of these fucking trips where he thinks he's hallucinating or he's dreaming, Dewey is always the one who's kind of knocking him out of that, like, trance, I guess. But yeah, as you can see here, Dewey fucking ate his food supply like a dick, and Bram does not appreciate it. My theory is that Dewey is actually the one defending him from his, like, trying to, like, pulling him out of those dreams that he's having. And, like, maybe the reason why he actually ate all this bread was to distract Bram and just, you know, pull him out of that. Like, he wasn't actually doing it to be a dick, like it seems here, but he was doing it for mystical intuition purposes. I don't know why Bram is trying to speak to a dog, considering dogs don't understand English, but for some reason this dog seems to totally understand English. It's kind of like when you watch one of those old cartoons where people talk to the dog, and even though the dog can't speak English and dogs don't realistically understand English, they just totally know what the person is saying. Anyway, so we head to this place. This is where the mayor is. We're trying to save his ass. Well, actually, Bram doesn't know that yet, but these dudes are. These dudes have been put into a corner by this secret cult, which surprisingly has a very large number of dudes in it. I'm not even sure that these guys are all cult dudes, but I guess we'll have to find out once I look at the video, the character descriptions. I'm not fully prepared for this commentary. I kind of just jumped in. So anyway, we got the dude on the left. He's Crowman. He's pretty cool. I mean, he's got a fucking cool-ass grin on his face. The other two dudes are kind of just like, well, we're damaged, so we can't move, which actually is a really good justification to explain why they can't, like, their AI doesn't let them move in this chapter. So I'll give them that, but at the same time, how the fuck are they actually still fighting? I don't know, I guess somebody could still, like, keep you at bay with their spear if they're on the ground, like, with a broken leg, so there's that to think about. But yeah, so Bram shows up. It's kind of like that one PlayStation 1 RPG where that one guy, he's like, I am the reinforcements! Well, guess what? Bram is the reinforcements here, alongside his dog. And nobody seems to call this into question, but then again, we are talking to a fucking human-sized crow. So I guess that's something you should surmise from this, that Dewey being all this weird and special and shit is not all that surprising. Now what is surprising is the fact that he just jumped over a fucking armory to dive into the water so that he can reach some grate up north to get a key from the enemies. That's what you're supposed to do. That's how you get into the fucking place up north where the boss is hidden. That's Malcolm. Thank God for his name thing. I have a really hard time remembering names. So yeah, Donald is a guy he's kind of like Dorcas. Both of these guys are kind of just humble dudes, just fighting to protect their mayor and shit. This is Maglyphos. He kind of reminds me of, man, this game reminds me of a lot of stuff I just remembered. He's kind of like Hientz from Fire Emblem 7. And hey, look at that! An old lady's talking to a dog and just being like, you know, you look like you're having a really tough time. Here, have this green tea that you totally have the ability to drink with your paws. It's a little silly. I'll be straight up. I think the plot is a little silly. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, mind you, especially since just recently I played Heirs of Rage, which is definitely a silly plot, but, you know, so there you go. I don't think it's all that silly. Because I haven't been training up Bram super excessively, I guess, he hasn't been performing well. Like, I mean, he's having trouble fighting these fighter dudes. I remember in a previous version of the hack, Bram was actually kind of ridiculous. Like, you basically could just rush most chapters and not even give a shit. But here we are. Bram is struggling. So yeah, the goal of this chapter is to head up north, defeat the boss, and save the mayor. Pretty nice goal. And also, check out all these animations. I forgot to bring that up. I remember those soldier animations actually from, like, Dream of 5. I remember them being in that game. And they're still just as nice as they were then. Oh, but who is this? Who is this in the broken village? It's Captain Strokey Chin. Actually, no, let's come up with a better name. This is the kind of guy you'd expect to be sitting by the fireplace, drinking some fucking tea and smoking a cigar and just being like, how does evil manifest itself? He's like some fucking philosopher, but Actually, he's a dude who's really into politics. I don't know if he's a politician, but I guess we'll find out. He's a very astute dude, which makes sense because he's a mage, and mages are essentially kind of like scholars. Kind of like Kanas from FE7. So, what the green tea does, which I just got from the village, is that increases your resistance. It's kind of like the pure water of this game. So before I talk further, actually, I wanna touch upon Malcolm. So Malcolm is kind of like a foot unit who can fly and also use bows. Like, imagine a Pegasus rider with like 5 or 6 move, and instead of spears, they use bows. That's what Malcolm is. It's a very, out of all the classes in this game, I think that this one is by far the most original. And this is coming from a game that also has, like, classes of enemies that can swim in the water, for example, which we'll be seeing later on in this chapter. And, like, fucking enemies that are bees. Like, I shit you not. I know I'm spoiling shit here, but bear with me. So, I mean, that's a reoccurring theme with this hack, is that a lot of Ghast's ideas are very original, which is something I think is much needed in this Fire Emblem community, because, like, I feel like many Fire Emblem hacks are limited by their, you know, their insistence to stick to commonly held traditions in the Fire Emblem series. Like, for example, doing all portraits in the same style as Fire Emblem. As we can see, Heirs of Rage broke, like, it defied that tradition, and this game is kind of making new classes and shit, and that's because, well, Ghast is an artist. So naturally, he's gonna have the animation chops to be able to get away with that shit, you know? Like, if this was, I can't imagine making a custom class of my own if I didn't have the ability to make a cool animation for it. And I will say that Malcolm has a fucking cool animation. Like, he does this fucking flip, and then he shoots the arrow. I'm not sure how practical that is realistically to, like, fly in and shoot, but there you go. So this conversation, Bram's just like, yeah, stay there. Okay, that's it. Oh, and this dude's like, oh, you seem a little cocky. Don't get too cocky, Star Fox. And Bram's like, well, I have other friends. I mean, he's not by himself. I don't know why the other dude was like, are you sure you can handle this on your own? Because he clearly isn't. But there you go. That's what the game assumes. Okay, so give me a second to collect my thoughts. So, as you can see, there is a brigand going over to the village in the top right. We have to get to him in time before he destroys it. Luckily, Ghast had the sense to be like, okay, the player's not going to be able to adapt right away. Let's give them a little extra leeway so that we can give them the time to bring Malcolm over there to attack that guy and distract them from the village. The conversation I just saw just went over my head. I was too focused on the brigand thing. Now, something you might have noticed with this chapter is that it's actually kind of boring. That's kind of one of the issues I have with it, to be honest. Like, you have this initial rush. This chapter suffers from, like, the typical Fire Emblem hack syndrome, where at the start of the chapter, there's a bunch of enemies rushing after you, and it's very stressful. I would argue that this isn't very stressful because the enemies don't really pose much of a threat. But there is some intricate enemy, intricate ally placement that kind of makes it a bit more interesting. But after you're done with that, the chapter just kind of dies off. Like, for the next few chapters, what you're going to be seeing, well, for the next few turns, what you're going to be seeing is I'm just moving up and bait and switching the enemies. And you guys know very well how much I disapprove of that kind of design. So, here's what I would suggest to Ghast. I feel like the enemies need to be spaced out more interestingly. Like, I wrote up a tutorial while kind of just expressing my opinions on enemy placements. What you want to do is you want to look at the player's expected path through the chapter. Now, obviously, they're going to head north after they defeat the initial enemies. But you also want to make the initial enemy placement interesting. Like, when Bram is dealing with the dudes that are attacking the NPCs at the beginning, I feel like you could be doing a little more with that in terms of a concept, because I like the idea that we're, like, forming this wall alongside NPCs and trying to defend against the enemies, but, like, all you do, essentially, is stand in place, and if you're low in health, stand on the tree to the left. Hell, you can even stand on the tree to the left the whole time, I think. I'm not sure, I haven't tried it, really. But yeah, like, after that initial rush, there's not many enemies that are placed to make things interesting. I feel like you could, for example, make it more difficult for Malcolm to get to the Brigand, but at the same time, you place the Brigand in a spot where you absolutely must rush towards them, and there's not much we can do aside from just having Malcolm go over there, because none of our other units can really fly over the river and stuff. So there's not really much of an ability for us to stop what's in Malcolm's way. So the issue arises that you could make that more difficult, but at what point does it become too ridiculous? So anyway, I don't know why this Pegasus Rider was here, considering all it does is just stand there and wait to get killed. You can, like, it will attack if you're in range, but that's not likely to happen. Because, like, the knights that are guarding the entrance to the boss are pretty far away from that Pegasus Rider, and the Pegasus Rider itself isn't going to become a threat unless the Brigand gets close enough to the village that attacking him with the bow would put you in the range of the Pegasus Rider, but that really happens, so that's like kind of a pointless enemy placement. Also, you saw what I just did. I placed Dewey on the grate, and now he's sneaking into the enemy headquarters, and he's gonna nab the key from them. It's an interesting idea, but I don't really feel like it has much of a point. Like, it demonstrates that, oh, Dewey is a very crafty dog, which I think is fine in terms of characterization, but in terms of gameplay, functionally what you're doing is you're making the player do kind of a pointless action. Like, you're making the player waste turns just so that they can get the key, bring it to the front, and open it. So in my opinion, it doesn't really need to happen, and if you want to characterize Dewey as being crafty and shit, I feel like there are better ways to do it. Like, for example, at the beginning of the chapter, what you did is you saw him outsmart Bram. And I think that's perfectly sufficient, to be honest. You don't need to go into any further fucking detail. So there you go. This chapter, as you can see, it has a lot of ideas, it's just it doesn't really execute them well because there's not much. Like, the strategies that you're employing in order to defeat the enemies is not very complicated, and it's not very thought-provoking. Now, that said, I will say that fighting this boss is kind of interesting, because, one, the boss is a tough fucking nail to crack, and I think the moment you open the door to the boss, that's when these enemy reinforcements show up. So you can make a choice of taking your time to defeat the enemies, or, alternatively, you could rush to defeat the boss while dealing with those enemies, and that's what I ended up doing for this chapter. And that ended up making it quite interesting. So I do like this last bit that you have here. It's just that the middle, the main chunk of the chapter is just kind of weak. Oh, we got more conversations. As far as I'm concerned, Malcolm's just like, oh, you're an adorable dog, and that's about it. So, something else I want to touch upon is, I want to talk about the number of cutscenes in this game, because there's a lot. To give you an idea, without editing, this footage ended up being about 35 minutes. And I edited the video so that all the gameplay was sped up, but all the cutscenes were not. Now, there were also parts where I didn't speed up the gameplay. In this case, I did it when I was fighting the boss, so that we could see his boss quote and his death quote. So, by my definition, those do count as cutscenes. So I counted those up. I counted all the conversations that you have to go through in this chapter, as well as the beginning and the ending events. And it turned out that the chapter has, like, at least based on my speed of going through the cutscenes, it has about 18 minutes worth of cutscenes. Now, that means that half of the footage was cutscenes. That's a lot. And what bugs me is that while some of the dialogue I do like, you know, the whole, like, this shit-talking right here between Bram and Maglyphos is pretty cool. And also the politician mage dude has an interesting little bit at the end where he talks about, like, this cult that we're dealing with right now. And, like, how their origins is unknown. That gives this cult kind of an air of mystery, and I kind of like that. However, there's also a lot of stuff in the cutscenes that feels like unnecessary fluff. Like, something you're gonna notice near the end of this chapter is that there comes a point where it feels like the cutscene should have ended, but then they just keep going on. So, you know, I think Ghast would benefit from making the dialogue a bit more concise. And if I do remember, there is a chapter later on in this game where the cutscenes are, like, insanely long. I'm talking mostly about, I think it's chapter 1-4. It gets really excessive, and it's just the opening cutscene. So I definitely feel like what Ghast could do is he could cut them down, but then there's a dilemma, because obviously what he wants to do is he wants to characterize the characters and make us like them. But at the same time, you have to make the cutscenes more concise. And it seems to me like it would be very hard to have your cake and eat it in that case. I mean, I guess you could characterize while being efficient, but I think it would be very hard to do. And that's why Ghast has a bunch of interactive events throughout the chapter. I actually think that was a good idea. Like, that is a good way to characterize the characters, but then you have to accommodate for the fact that maybe the player does not actually look at those cutscenes, so you have to still characterize the characters in the cutscenes. But in my opinion, it's just better to have characterization as optional, and that it's just better to have all this plot stuff as just the essential part of the cutscenes. But yeah, like right here, this is what I was talking about. The politician dude is like, yeah, so we have a cult, and they want to purge the world. Their origins is unknown. There's a lot that people claim happened, but they could be debunked. That's pretty cool. And I also kind of like the cutscene, well, the bit where Bram has a one-on-one talk with this dude right here. In the original Bloodlines, Bram would talk to this mayor dude and be like, wow, this guy's a fucking pussy. And he does more or less say that here, but he says it in a much nicer way, which I think actually kind of works out. I kind of get the impression, now, feel free to blow me way out of the water about this, but I think Ghast generally has a problem with people who don't do their job. This is just conjecture, so don't mind me on this. But Ghast seems like a very tough-minded person based on what I know of him. And he takes promises very seriously, which, you know, understandable. When you make a promise, you should follow through on it. But, you know, it's also just based on what I know of him over the years as well. Like, he doesn't take anybody's fucking bullshit, and if you fail to do something, it's your own damn fault. So, here, we have Bram telling the mayor, just be like, hey, dude, send some fucking dudes to protect my village. And the mayor's like, I can't do that because, you know, I'm not the one in charge. You know? The guy above me is like, no, that village isn't worth protecting because it doesn't provide much economically for us. Which, Bram brings up an interesting point that if you guard the village and make it a better place, it will become more prosperous, and therefore the problem will solve itself. It'll be a win-win situation, which I think is very smart. That's something I do like about the dialogue, is that while I'm not particularly emotionally invested, I will say that in terms of reason and logic, the characters demonstrate themselves as being very level-headed, sensible characters. So there you go. Now, this here is one of the cutscenes I think is kind of unnecessary. Because here Bram is like, well, let's head off. And then we're gonna see some bandits have their little yuck-yuck talk right here, I think. Oh, nope, not there. But we will see it in a sec. But basically, it seems to me that in this cutscene, Gas was trying to justify why these dudes, even though they don't really have much of a connection with Bram, should follow him around. So, what Gas does is he has this little cutscene here, right here, there we go, where these bandits want to take revenge on Bram, and then the Crow dude and his buddies are like, hey, did you hear that? Well, maybe we should help Bram because he helped us. And I feel like this could have just been handled at the beginning of the opening chapter. Like, he could have even excluded this cutscene and just like been like, okay, so Bram gets attacked by these bandits. Bram's like, oh shit, I don't think I can handle them. And then, fucking shit, the Crow and his buddies jump in and are like, we're here to help. And Bram's like, why? Well, we couldn't just leave you hanging, you know? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Like, that would have been a fucking awesome way to do it. But instead we get this fucking cutscene here where it's just like, oh, those guys might attack him. And then we get this cutscene, which I also think is a little bit unnecessary. Because it's like, firstly, I don't know what's going on. You're introducing a lot of elements and kind of overwhelming the player with all this information, rather than letting them kind of discover it organically. Like, you know how in most Fire Emblem games that they always start by establishing the continents and shit? I find that bullshit fucking boring. I just want to get straight to the heart of the story, like the characters. Like, FE7, yes, it does have the continent thing, but it gets straight to Eliwood's motivation. Oh, he wants to save the fucking, his dad. And so he's on a quest, and he, like, the cutscenes demonstrate that he's a kind-hearted but humble dude. And that's all you really need to give a shit about the plot. But here we get all this information that doesn't really seem all that relevant to the cutscene, and to the story. And I understand that eventually it will come up, eventually, but it doesn't feel relevant. It's not like, you know how in Fire Emblem 7, they introduce the Black Fang, and they talk about him, they speculate about him for a bit, but they don't actually show the villains until later on, after they've been established, like, in the story, after they've become relevant? That's kind of what I feel should have happened here. Now, I think those are fair criticisms. I wasn't a fan of that chapter, but I don't think it's unsalvageable either. I think unsalvageable is too harsh a word. I think that with a few minor fixes, it'll be fine. So there you go. Hopefully what I said was insightful. Hopefully I didn't seem too off the cuff with my criticisms. And I hope this video was entertaining, so there you go.
I need someone to review my FE hack. He needs to be someone who won't cut me slack. It's Monkey Joe, he's arrived from his golden chariot, and down he walks the road, brow saying, what the hell you got, Monkey Joe? These ambush bombs just don't do it for me. In this map I should be caught by three. Monkey Joe.